This lecture is to review some important themes regarding Christian theological anthropology. First off, it's important to consider the three terms here: Christian, theological, anthropology. So Christian refers to the Christian religion, Jesus, the Son of God, who becomes the Christ, the Anointed One, who was born of the Virgin Mary, died, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead, and buried, and on the third day rose again from the dead. The Christian story, right? The Christian perspective. Now, implied in that are that there are other theological anthropologies. A Buddhist theological anthropology would look very different. A Muslim, a Hindu, all of those kinds of religious perspectives on the nature of humanity, anthropology, have profound implications for the meaning here. And theological, this is coming from a specific study of God, a Christian theological approach, right? So not a Buddhist theological approach, which there are, right? A Buddhist would have a very different conception of the nature of God. Muslims, again, Islam, Hindus, all of the world religions have a specific theological understanding of the nature of God. Anthropology simply is about the study of humanity, human nature, what makes humans different from other biological beings. Those are the kinds of stories, connections and meanings therein of these three words. So this lecture is going to focus on a Christian theological, a Christian approach to understanding God, and what that means for Christians, and how Christians understand what it means to be human. Moving into this, the main passage that's very crucial herein is Genesis 1:26 through 28, and this passage comes from the New American Standard Bible, or the NASB. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female. He created them, and God blessed them, and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." And so we can see here a couple of things. First are, what does this passage imply about the purpose and the role that humans play in God's created world? Now remember, this is the culmination, right? God's made light and dark, earth and sky, the different creatures in the sea, on the land, and in the earth, and then humanity is the crowning image of this. This is especially coming from Psalm 8, and also Genesis 2, which talks about kind of humanity's, Adam's initial living in this primordial garden. So we rule over, have dominion, or stewardship might be a way to think about this. Fish, birds, cattle, over the earth, creeping things on the earth. And then this idea of being created in God's own image. That's a crucial component, a differentiated component to other worldview perspectives on human nature. Somehow we are in God's image and likeness. So we'll spend a lot of time in this lecture and throughout the course reflecting on, what does that mean? What does it mean to be made in God's image, and what does that look like? In terms of what does this imply? What can we know about the Creator if we see His image in humanity? And what does it say about us as the creature? So theologically, we can think that there are three main answers to these questions. There are functional, structural, and relational approaches to understanding what it means to be made in God's image. Functionally, the emphasis here is on action, and also this idea of vocation that we'll get into in a little bit. But that is, what we do somehow images God, or is us acting in God's likeness. stewarding creation, developing creation, enhancing creation, taking creation from its initial state and shepherding it. So like taking the seed of a plant, planting it, and then being a good steward, having good fertilizer and watering the plant as the plant blossoms. Right, we are enhancing it, we are moving it, we are stewarding, shepherding that aspect of creation, which is a functional way that we image God. We are acting in God's image. Many theologians have focused also on structural domains, which means characteristics or attributes. Do humans image God in their ability to reason and be rational beings? Is it in the exercise of the will or our ability to make choices that helps us to be structurally image bearers of God? Souls, is it the soulishness of humans that help us to image God? So there's structural components. And finally, there's a relational emphasis as well, right? Male and female, right? These distinct, separate categories, maleness, femaleness, and then their interrelationships. And somehow that relationship is identified as imaging God, right? So as we read in Genesis 2, Adam being alone, so to speak, in that moment, and God looks at him and says, "It's not good for you to be alone." So the femaleness and the maleness kind of complementary complete this image of God, which we would argue in terms of a Trinitarian perspective helps us to understand God's image as plurality. So Stanley Grentz summarizes the creation of the human creature as being dependent on God, right? So we get our life and our breath and everything comes from God's gracious gift. So we depend on God in exercising our function in our structural domains and our relationships. Those are all dependent on God's good graces to support them. God is the sole purpose of our existence. We exist to function as God has made us to function, to live out and to engage in our relationships using our structures, our faculties. And then there's an intended purpose for the human creation. There's a telos, that is, God's created the world naively, right? It exists, but it's not all it could be. And so humanity is supposed to foster and move creation toward a clear and specific telos, or goal, or outcome. There's an objective to reach in that way. And so those are really important things to remember as we continue through this process. Dependent on God describes how the human creatures are above the creation, but are not God. I refer to Psalm 8 for you to review that. God forms a transcendent context for the first humans and all subsequent humans. So God's presence and his transcendence imbues itself in the creation, and it supports the creation. God's rules and laws are written in our hearts. God's purposes and plans are there for us to discern and to live into and support. Human existence is originated in God because of one's present existence and generic human nature. And humans are created with a purpose for God. Humans are purposeful beings. To that end, we can think about this idea of the image of God and its role in work. And so, functionally speaking, the image of God, this calling or royal dimension, is related to governing well, stewarding our resources financially, vocationally. So in this sense, this idea of having dominion over the creatures of the earth is important, right? We don't want to remove or to abuse any of the creatures that we are governing, or to not take care of the created world, the earth that we live in. Or likewise, sociologically or societally speaking, we want to engage in very much governing relationships. And so this is the idea of calling. Os Guinness differentiates between a primary and secondary calling. So our primary calling in Christian perspective is developing an identity in Christ. We are, because of Christ's saving work on the cross, we are part of God's family. We have been adopted. Our identity is as a child of God. Secondarily, we live out that identity as a Christian, as a child of God, through Christ's saving work in every other aspect of our lives, in all the roles that we find ourselves in, as parents, as spouses, as children of our older adults, of our parents. We live out our primary calling in our secondary callings, and all of those are related to living out this royal or functional image that is the governance, in terms of a vassal or a king, right? So the metaphor is as the king is the center leader in a kingdom, the king or the queen will give fiats to his or her lieutenants and other royals, and then those royals are given leeway to govern, to support the king's or the queen's ideals or desires. And so that's the idea, that we function that way as ambassadors, living out our secondary calling in the roles that we find ourselves in. Structurally speaking, we can think about how we live out this liberating or redeeming. So due to Genesis chapter 3, the Christian perspective on sin, the world is a broken place, and we are broken people, and we begin to work and to move and to steward our resources to liberate people from bondage and redeem back creation. Right? And so in Genesis chapter 3, we read how there are thorns and thistles now, and how work will be done with toil. So we take that and we begin to redeem it. We begin to support people that need help. We begin to challenge and to live into and develop a more positive structural faculty or capacity in us to live out our calling. And finally, relationally, we can see that we partner with God in creation, right? So it's not us alone. It's us working with God and other people to redeem and to liberate, to function as stewards over God's creation that way. So all of this is based in a Trinitarian understanding of God. Now, Trinity is the Christian doctrine that God is actually three persons, Father, Son, and Spirit, in function, that share the same substance, or they are it's one God, ontologically, or in his being and nature, but functionally, God works and has these different roles. So God as Father is creator and sustainer, God as Son is regent and redeemer, and God as Spirit is empowering and supporting and enlivening and the life-giving nature. Now, the Father in relation to the Son and Spirit are all intermingled. The theological word here is parokehesis is the word here, which is mutual indwelling. So we can't distinguish the being, but we can distinguish the doing, so to speak. The Father is distinct from the Son, and the Son is distinct from the Spirit and the Father, and likewise the Spirit is distinct from the Father and the Son, and we can discern their different roles and activities in the world and in the way that the different things that happen. So this idea is that there's a particular unique identity, there's a particularity, Father, Son, and Spirit, each are particular, but these particularities are embedded in relatedness or interrelationships that way. So if humans function as they partner with God to have appropriate dominion over the creations, humans function faithfully as they live out their callings, their primary callings, as embodying and in living into their secondary callings. And people have many secondary callings, called to be parents, called to be children, called to be husbands, wives, called to be garbage people, the sanitation workers, called to be professors, called to be secretaries, called to be CEOs. So we live out our primary identity, our primary calling, our identity, in our secondary callings or our vocations. We humans enter partnership with God as governor to restore the creation and through its liberation and restoring its intended purpose, and we partner with God as liberators and redeemers in that process. So this leads up to, and we already hinted at this, at the end of Genesis chapter 2, we see where God commands Adam and Eve, I want you to name the animals, I want you to till the land and to be stewards of the earth. I don't want you to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Alright, so Adam and Eve in this moment are given a boundary, a parameter. You can do all this other stuff, but you can't have the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And so we're left with that. Unfortunately, though, what happens is in Genesis 3, the serpent comes in and says to Eve, wow, that's a really good looking tree. I bet you the fruit's really good. And Eve says, yeah, that's true, but God said we can't eat it. And if we do eat it, we are going to die. Which she embellished the command from God. Right? As we see here, there isn't that command or that necessity that you will die. And so the serpent is like, will you really die? I don't think you're really going to die. And so then, of course, Eve takes of the fruit and then gives it to Adam, and they both eat the fruit, which introduces the first transgression, right? The first sin, they going against God's command in that sense. And so this introduces the Christian notion of sin, and we will have much to say about sin in a couple of lectures. So for now, though, what we can think about is sin relies on human agency. Right? Adam and Eve needed to have the ability to choose in that moment, choose a negative trajectory or a positive trajectory. And so what we can think of is sinning must be understood in the context of its relation to the general human longing for goodness. So what that means is that, generally speaking, part of human nature is to strive for and be oriented toward a goodness. Goodness, we like goodness, we like beauty, we like to work toward those things. We appreciate aesthetically pleasing art forms, music, and moving toward good, right? Now, in this sense, though, the fruit in the garden of good and evil, or from the tree of good and evil, was good, right? That's not bad fruit, and it was pleasing. We were just given a parameter not to eat it. And so the initial humans longing for that goodness thwarted, right? It put them on a negative trajectory, and they chose to take that. And so, as a result, humans were created to fully enter into good relationships with good objects, divine and created. However, we're ambiguously oriented that way, right? That fruit of the knowledge of good and evil was good, but it wasn't good for us to eat. Right? And that tension there is important to maintain. So we oftentimes choose. We don't oftentimes choose in our best interests, and that also means that not all good objects, goodness is good for us, and we need to discern and move into that. So humans desire to be related to good objects and secure relations with them. It's in our intention, so we act intentionally. We can judge between objects, discern, right? Not being judgmental, but discerning. There's a motivation, a desire for certain goods over other goods, and we can act to attain those perceived goods. Unfortunately, though, being ambiguously connected to those good objects sometimes means that we act in a counterproductive perspective or opportunity to get those good acts, and to attain those good acts. So all of these things mean that sin is an orientation to living that destroys community. It destroys relationships with our families. It destroys relationships from one community to another. It's anti-relational. Sin is also an orientation that impedes God's intentions for the world. It prevents them, or it thwarts them, or it takes good things and it makes them. It bonds them and it binds them and it really enslaves and entraps people. and it's an orientation that inhibits or destroys individual well-being. And so we see here, based on our desire to have good objects, that sometimes we choose to take those good objects and thwart or impede God's intentions for them. Sometimes those good objects can inhibit or destroy our individual well-being, or we choose objects that inhibit or destroy our individual well-being. And sin then also destroys community and breaches relationships. Theologically, we can also think about the three types of relational images, the three components of the image of God as relation, function, and structure, and its impact as being alienation, condemnation, enslavement, and depravity. So alienation in this way is that human failure robs the humans of the enjoyment of community God intends for them. There's alienation, right? There's separation and isolation. We read the first humans run away from one another because of the shame that they experienced, right? So there's that breach in their relationships, and further, that becomes a description for the natural chain of events. We read in Genesis 3:15, 16 and 17, that the wife begins to desire her husband, but the husband will rule over that. There'll be this alienating power structure in their relationship now, and the man is described to engage in alienating work. Right, there's separation or distance or isolation between the man and the created world that way. So alienation is a profound result. Condemnation. The second consequence of sin is being condemned. In Romans 3:23 and 4 read, "All have sinned and are not good enough for God's glory, and all need to be made right with God by His grace, which is a free gift. They mean to be made free from sin through Jesus Christ." So we are all under God's righteous judgment. Humans are condemned in God's sight. Because of our solidarity with the first Adam and our inability to follow God's intended laws, we are all deemed judged. We've all fallen short of God's glory, and therefore we all are in need of a Savior. Enslavement is the third consequence of sin, and so Jesus says in John 8:34, "I tell you the truth, everyone who lives in sin is a slave to sin." Paul candidly confesses that he knows that the law is spiritual, but I am not spiritual, since sin rules me as if I were its slave. This enslavement means we are in bondage to a hostile alien force that has overwhelmed us. Sin has usurped the place God would have in one's life. We're trapped. We are stuck in our own negative choices. Perhaps the easiest way to conceptualize this enslavement is the idea of addiction, where physiologically and psychologically the substance has power over us. Right? We can't not drink, and drink is killing us. It's destroying our relationships. It's in destroying our ability to work. It's in destroying our ability to be a spouse or a parent, and we're trapped here. We are enslaved that way. Finally, depravity. So this idea is the natural outcome of experiencing alienation from God, being enslaved in sin, and being judged or condemned in God's sight. Depravity characterizes the totally helpless conditions that humans are in. There's nothing that we can do about it. We are trapped here. And our choices, even good choices, are usually done secondarily to benefit us, right? So that everything we do is tainted by sin. In short, our human existence is to be altered. It will require the help of a power outside of ourselves, a power greater than sin. Depravity forces humans to look toward Christ as the only way to salvation. So this leads to our understanding of Jesus as the culminating, or the second Adam, right? The first Adam caused us to all be under sin Christ as the second Adam, what happens in Christ as being the only human that was able to fulfill God's law and to take on God's righteous judgment that we've all sinned, but because Jesus was sinless, he took that on and allows us to experience forgiveness. Right? Jesus satisfies God's wrath that sin has caused. Right? There is a negative outcome, right? A just negative outcome that humans are sinful now. Jesus takes that on, becomes our punishment, and because of that, we receive forgiveness. And so God doesn't see our sinfulness anymore. He sees Christ's sinlessness, and that allows us to experience forgiveness because of Christ's saving work on the cross. So in this sense, Jesus reconciles humans to God through Jesus' sacrifice. Jesus reestablishes God's desire for relationships with humans. Jesus becomes God's expression of passion to all humanity and the created order. And so, in this sense, Christ becomes the atoning sacrifice that God's justice demands. Christ takes on human sin and declares the sinful sinless. Jesus' blood covers the human sin so that God's righteous verdict of condemnation need no longer fall on us. Christ, in this sense, reconciles us from human enslavement to sin. We are free. We are free from sin, and we are free to become Christ-like in our actions. So as we enter more fully into our primary calling, our identity as Christians, as being Christ-like, fulfilling that calling to become more disciples of Christ, then we begin to become free to live out our secondary callings to fulfill our role in God's created community. And as a result of this, then all of those earthly categories, male, female, Jew, Greek, slave free, all of them are equal in God's sight, because God, through Christ, has fundamentally altered the nature of the world, and so we are all heirs of God through Christ in that way, and so we're all the same. So the core of this section in particular is the transformation of the human categories through Christ's redemptive work. So any sociological category used to give preferences from one group or person over another no longer carries any significance in God's kingdom or in God's sight. The statement equally disadvantages all by equally advantaging all. So everyone has equal status in God's kingdom. And of course, Christ profoundly changes deprived human nature. As deprived human nature is the consequence of alienation, enslavement, and condemnation, Christ becomes the human substitute for human nature. Christ bears these full repercussions of God's anger, and as such, humans no longer bear the ultimate consequences of sin. Jesus' death means humans no longer need to experience eternal separation from God. So all of these themes lead us to understand a Christian theological understanding, a Christian understanding of what the Bible, what Christianity says about human nature and what that means for humans. So as we are continuing thinking about human nature and Christian theological anthropology, I would ask you to reflect on what you believe it means to be human, what it means in terms of a sociological perspective, a psychological perspective. How do we understand human nature and what it means for how we live our lives today?